The carpet is too clean to make a sound. Even your footsteps feel like they've been absorbed by the hush of high finance, muffled by marble, glass, and the low hum of fluorescent light buzzing behind layers of tinted windows. It's 1986. The skyline outside is cut with ambition, all jagged chrome and ambition, while inside this Wall Street office tower, 100 versions of you are rehearsing how to be perfect. You wear a charcoal blazer with shoulder pads just firm enough to say, "I belong," and your tie is knotted like you practiced it 4 times this morning. You haven't made a mistake yet, not one. And yet it always feels like someone else is clapping, like you're applauding yourself from behind a thick, one-way mirror. Have you ever felt like that? Like you've done everything right? Followed the script, kept your voice steady, your head down, and still somehow ended up farther from yourself than when you started. You don't have to answer. Just listen and let another lifetime speak for you. This is sleep through lifetimes. Each night, we let the current of time carry us, while the mind drifts lightly across the surface of memory. Whether you're already comfortable or still finishing something, that's perfectly fine. No need to analyze or focus. Just let everything unfold as it is. Where and at what time are you listening from? Drop a line below. Perhaps someone far away is journeying with you right now. Before we set off, I don't need likes or subscribes. I only hope that if you drift off midway, your sleep will be calm and your heart as light as a leaf. All right, let's allow the road ahead to tell the rest. You were born in a brick apartment above a deli in Queens. Not the flashy part with polished sidewalks, but a quieter street where the corner store knew your name and your dad always smelled like newspaper ink. He was a man of rules, not harsh, just tightly wound. The kind of man who tucked in every shirt and believed in the clean dignity of doing things the right way. You watched him leave each morning with a briefcase older than you, and when it broke, he didn't replace it. He had it mended. When you were 10, he brought you to Manhattan once. Just once. He pointed up at a tall building and said, "That's where real decisions are made." You didn't understand at the time, but you nodded anyway, trying to etch it in your bones. High school came, and you worked hard, not with flair, not the way the loud kids did, but you got things done. Teachers liked you. Not because you were charming, but because you didn't make trouble. You applied to business school the way one folds laundry, neatly, quietly, with no room for wrinkles. You didn't dream of Wall Street, but it was the one thing you knew your father would nod at. You got the internship before your final year. It wasn't from connections, just persistence. A black and white resume printed at the library and a tie borrowed from your cousin. The day they called to offer it, you barely celebrated. You just told your dad, and he gave you that single nod, his version of a hug. Your first morning in the financial district, you wore shoes half a size too big. Your father's old Oxfords, polished until the past couldn't cling to them. They clicked on the pavement like you belonged. You almost believed it. Inside the firm, the world was louder than you'd expected. Not in volume, but in energy. People moved like they had somewhere more important to be. Conversations never paused. They just ricocheted. You didn't understand most of the jargon, but you smiled and said, "Will do," even when you weren't sure what you'd just agreed to. Mostly, you ran errands, coffee orders, document runs, courier pickups, but you were fast, polite, invisible in the way people trusted. They gave you more tasks. You never missed a deadline, never spilled a latte. You didn't shine, you just never slipped. One senior analyst once joked, "You're like a ghost who gets things done." You laughed, but later, walking back to the elevator, it echoed a little too close. A ghost who gets things done. You watched others from behind their cubicle walls. The loud ones with gold watches. The confident ones who called the VPs by nickname. You began to mimic their walk. You practiced phrases like, "Let me circle back," and "Let's pencil it in," even though your voice cracked a little on pencil. Once, you caught your reflection in the black screen of a turned-off monitor. You looked correct. That was the only word for it. Not bad, not remarkable, just correct. You kept wearing the Oxfords until the sole started to split. Then you tucked them into a box and left them under your bed, unable to throw them out. You didn't need them anymore, but something about discarding them felt disrespectful, like betraying the only version of yourself that made sense. Your performance reviews were glowing, not colorful, just competent, dependable. They wrote, "Low maintenance." It was meant as praise, but it sounded like a refrigerator manual. You didn't mind. At least they noticed. But did they? One afternoon, while making copies, you saw your name misspelled on a staff email. Twice. The third time, it was someone else's name entirely. You corrected it quietly. No one replied. At night, walking home through the narrow streets between towers, you sometimes caught glimpses of your reflection in shop windows. Not the whole you, just slices. Your shoulder in the glass of a cafe, your forehead in the dark shine of a taxi. Your outline reflected in the revolving doors of a building you didn't belong to. It was enough to start wondering if you'd somehow stepped into a role too early, like a play you didn't audition for, but got cast in anyway. And now the audience kept clapping before your lines were done. You didn't tell anyone about these thoughts. Not even your mother, who still asked if you were eating enough. You smiled and said yes. You always said yes. Because that's what a good intern did. The first time you held the copy keycard to your own desk drawer. It felt like something ceremonial. Not quite a promotion, but close enough to feel like recognition. The desk was small, wedged beside the fax machine, humming with the heat of constant messages. And yet, to you, it was territory. You had earned a square meter of this empire. And your name was finally spelled right on the placard. Still no title, just your name. But this time, the letters stayed. You settled into a rhythm: arrive early, leave late, never complain. You were the one who reminded people of forgotten documents before meetings, who checked numbers they hadn't asked you to check, who filled in missing slides at 11:30 p.m. so someone else could present them at 9 a.m. You never asked for credit. But it was hard not to notice when someone else took it. You told yourself it didn't matter. That being needed was more important than being noticed. But that belief started to wobble the day your manager introduced you in a meeting. By the wrong name again. You corrected him. He laughed it off. He's the guy who saves my life every week. He joked, whatever his name is. People laughed, so you laughed too, that afternoon. While refilling the coffee pot in the break room, someone asked if you were new. You weren't, but maybe you still were. You started dressing sharper. A slim tie with a gold pin. A navy blazer that fit just right. Not too ambitious, not too dull. You watched others and picked up details. How they held eye contact, when to interrupt, how to carry confidence like a briefcase. You copied their posture. You learned the cadence of a good joke, never too loud, always timed with the end of someone else's sentence. And still, in the elevator, no one quite made space for you. You carried your own name inside like a folded note, readable, but private. The badge on your chest said, Associate, but it didn't say you. It said a version of you that everyone could use. The person they called when something broke, when a presentation crashed, when a number didn't add up and no one had time to fix it. You became a fixer, efficient, essential, replaceable. Your father didn't understand the difference. Sounds like you're doing well, he said on the phone. Don't shake things up. His voice carried the same tone it did when warning you not to ruin your good shoes in the rain. You wanted to ask if he ever felt like this, like he'd gotten all the pieces right, but still built the wrong picture. But you didn't. You said, yeah, it's going well. At the office, you got a promotion, a real one this time. More responsibility, more hours, more respect. On paper, someone offered you a desk with a window view. Sliver of skyline, barely an inch wide between two cubicles. You took it anyway. Natural light felt like luxury. The view became a ritual. You'd catch glimpses of yourself in the reflection. Glass over glass, face over city. Sometimes you barely recognized your own eyes. There was a party that quarter. Champagne in plastic flutes, someone's playlist on too low a volume. People talked about vacations, bonuses, moving to better firms. You stood near the cheese platter and nodded. One of the senior partners clapped you on the back and said, "You're a real team player," then moved on before you could respond. You went home that night and stared at your ceiling for hours. Not unhappy, just flat. And the next morning, you still showed up early, still wore the same watch your father gave you. The one that always ran 2 minutes slow. You never fixed it. You liked being a little behind. It made you feel human. In that tiny sliver of window beside your desk, you noticed pigeons nesting on a ledge. You started bringing extra crumbs from your sandwich to scatter for them during lunch break. No one saw you do it, and that felt strangely comforting. You began to notice how many people walked the same loop each day. From the elevator to their desk, to the vending machine and back, without ever lifting their eyes. You started doing it too, until one afternoon, while taking the stairs, you skipped your floor by accident and stood in a completely unfamiliar hallway. The same building, same layout, but the people different, voices warmer, laughter less rehearsed. You stayed there for a minute, just watching, then turned around and walked back. It wasn't your floor. Not yet. You bought your first real suit on a rainy Thursday. Not off the rack this time, tailored. Navy with a charcoal pinstripe. The kind that felt heavier on the hanger, like it carried decisions in the lining. You stood awkwardly in the mirror while the tailor pinned the cuffs, muttering something about balance and posture. You nodded even though you weren't sure what he meant. When you picked it up a week later, you wore it straight to the office, even though it wasn't a client meeting day. You walked a little slower, hoping someone would notice. They didn't, but the receptionist did say, "Looking sharp today." You smiled at her longer than usual. She didn't look up. The truth was, the suit fit, perfectly even, but you didn't. Inside, something felt mismatched, like your skin hadn't caught up with your costume. Still, it didn't matter. You blended, and blending had gotten you this far. Meetings got easier. You learned how to nod at just the right moment, how to speak in polished sentences that sounded smart without committing to anything. You learned how to make people feel safe around you, mostly by never showing too much of yourself. It was an invisible skill, and it earned you trust. Your boss started letting you lead small calls. "Just guide them through the numbers," he said. You did flawlessly. No stumbles, no doubts. But when the client said, "Thanks, Michael," you didn't correct them. You just smiled and logged off. You started eating lunch at your desk more often. Not because you were busy, though you always said you were, but because sitting in the break room felt like theater. Everyone acting confident. everyone laughing at things that weren't funny. You weren't sure if they really liked each other or just needed an audience. So, you sat alone, sandwich, spreadsheet, window sliver, same pigeons. One afternoon, you found yourself staring not at the screen, but at the suit sleeve on your arm. There was a loose thread. You picked at it gently, trying not to pull. For a moment, you imagined the whole suit unraveling from that single point, seams splitting quietly, layer by layer, until you were just you. You stopped and smoothed it down. The more you succeeded, the less you knew what success was supposed to feel like. You hit all your metrics. You delivered everything on time. You got a corner desk, not the corner office, but close enough to pretend. And still, at night, lying in bed, your chest felt tight, like you'd swallowed too many versions of yourself. And now there was no room left to breathe. Once, at a happy hour, someone asked, "So, what do you actually like doing?" You answered with something safe. Reading. Maybe hiking. And they nodded like they hadn't really wanted to know anyway. Later, you realized you hadn't been lying. You just didn't remember what your answer used to be. You sometimes thought about quitting, not in a dramatic way, just slipping out, letting someone else take your seat, letting your name fade gently from the team sheet, like those old sticky notes that lose their grip. But quitting would mean explaining, and you didn't have the words. You weren't burned out. You weren't unhappy. You were just misaligned, like a machine that still runs, but not on anything it was built for. The elevators started to feel smaller, or maybe it was you. Standing straighter, smiling wider, holding your breath longer. You started seeing a man in the mirror who looked polished, approachable, someone who gave good handshake. But sometimes, in those late, night glimpses after brushing your teeth, you caught your own eyes and felt nothing. Not emptiness, not sadness, just absence, like you'd been edited out of your own life. And yet, every morning, the suit still fit. You never missed a day. You kept playing the role perfectly. You learned that applause comes in strange forms on Wall Street. Not clapping, not literal, but the nods, the forwarded praise, the invitation to sit in on bigger meetings. And you got them all, one by one. A portfolio win here, a good instincts. There. You became the kind of guy they said had a good head on his shoulders, reliable, sharp, someone who could handle things. They didn't say passionate. No one used that word. Your days became cleanly segmented. Wake, iron, commute, elevator, execute, repeat. Each part of your life folded so tightly into the next, it barely left a wrinkle. You were smooth, slick, efficient, but not quite present. There was a moment, barely a flicker, when your VP called you into his office and asked if you'd consider overseeing a new account. Big client, huge. "You've earned it," he said, motioning for you to sit. You didn't feel anything. You said yes anyway. That night, you sat on your apartment floor, still in your suit, and stared at the boxes you'd never unpacked. You'd lived there for 11 months, the walls still bare, the shelves still sparse. You picked up a framed photo of your college graduation that someone had given you. You hadn't even removed the protective film. You unpeeled it slowly. There you were, smiling, open, unshaped. A face full of something you couldn't name anymore. A coworker invited you to a networking event the following week. Rooftop, sky-high cocktails. Everyone looked like success. You recognized most of them by name, but not by face. And when someone asked, "So what do you do?" you gave your title, your firm, your function. Words that should mean something, but didn't. Not really. Later that evening, standing by the glass railing, you watched the city below blur into rivers of light. Someone lit a cigar beside you and said, "You look like you belong up here." You smiled, because you knew how to smile now. It wasn't a feeling. It was a skill. You remembered a quote someone once told you. That success is just performing the same scene well enough that no one questions the script. You didn't know who said it. Maybe you had made it up, but it stuck. You went to the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and practiced smiling with your eyes. It still didn't work. Back at the office, you continued to rise. You filled your planner with color-coded appointments. You subscribed to business journals you never read. You answered emails with speed and precision, using just the right amount of exclamation marks to seem approachable, without being overeager. You attended every client dinner, learned which fork to use, and when to laugh. People liked you, and still, you kept waiting for someone to pull you aside and ask, "Hey, are you really okay?" But no one did, because you looked fine. You were thriving, weren't you? You sometimes imagined faking an illness. Something mild, not dramatic. Just enough to step away for a few days without questions. To breathe without explaining. You never did it. Instead, you doubled down, sharpened the performance, refined the persona, got a haircut that said decisive, but not flashy, changed your cologne to something called Midnight Alloy. It smelled like citrus and spreadsheets. You started arriving 5 minutes early to every meeting, just to rehearse how to sit, straight but relaxed, attentive but not overeager. Your signature became cleaner, your voice more even. Your life, on paper, was immaculate. But one afternoon, while reviewing quarterly figures, you found yourself staring at a number and wondering what it even represented. Not just financially, but humanly. What was it measuring? Was it someone's savings? A company's lifeline? A quiet story of risk and hope? Or just a number? You blinked. You got back to work. You played the role perfectly. She got on at the 42nd floor. You had seen her around the office before. Blazer crisp, eyes alert, always clutching a coffee like it was armor. She was newer than you, but not by much. You'd shared a few meetings, exchanged a couple of dry laughs about the elevators never stopping where they should. That morning, you were both the last ones in. She exhaled sharply and muttered, "One of these days, I'm going to take the stairs and just never stop walking." You chuckled, then surprised yourself by replying, "I think I'd follow you." It wasn't a line. It just came out. She looked at you then, really looked. And for a second, you weren't playing any role. She smiled. "I'll hold you to that." Her name was Alina. She worked in client strategy. Smart, quick-witted, too perceptive. You saw each other more after that, not on purpose, not at first. But emails turned into hallway nods, then into after-hours debriefs, then into shared cab rides when the subways shut down. You didn't talk about work in the cab. You talked about nothing. About sandwiches that cost too much. About how fake plants in the lobby never gathered dust. About the strange quiet of the city at 3 a.m. It felt like something human, something unscripted. She invited you out one Saturday to an art show in Brooklyn. You didn't understand most of it, but she laughed at a sculpture of a melting calculator and whispered, "Pretty sure this one's about you." You laughed louder than you meant to. Later that evening, you stood on the platform waiting for the train. She leaned on your shoulder and said, "You don't really like this life, do you?" You hesitated, then said, "I like parts of it." It was the closest to honesty you'd been in months. She looked up. "What part are you?" You didn't answer. You didn't know. But you kissed her anyway. The relationship wasn't dramatic. No stolen moments in supply closets. No whispered calls during board meetings. It was quieter than that. Soft edges. She'd text you pictures of pigeons she saw, and you'd send back stock tickers shaped like hearts. You felt yourself soften, just a little. But it couldn't last. It ended on a Tuesday, just after Q1 results. You'd had a rough call, snapped at a junior. She called you out for it. Not in front of others, just you two, standing outside the office near a food cart that smelled like burnt onions. "You're not this person," she said, arms folded. You replied too quickly, "Maybe I am now." Her face changed. Not angry, just disappointed. Like someone realizing the story was over before the last page. You watched her walk away. She didn't look back. You didn't stop her. For weeks after, you played the same role, only tighter, neater. The tie cinched a little higher. The shoes polished a little harder. You became immaculate again. The ghost in the good suit. But now, there were moments when your mind drifted. In the middle of meetings, you'd catch yourself wondering what she was doing. Whether she still worked 2 floors down. Whether she ever looked at the same elevator door and remembered the joke about taking the stairs. The pigeons still came to your window. You stopped feeding them. The worst part wasn't the breakup. It was the silence that followed. No fights, no closure, just an open, ended absence that made everything louder, especially your own thoughts. You told yourself you were fine. You got a new plant for your desk. A real one this time. You water one day. Someone moved desks. You were assigned hers. Her drawer still had a hair tie. You didn't touch it. Just closed the drawer and turned back to your screen. The market was up. Your numbers were strong. Your role still perfect. You didn't feel the promotion when it happened. There was no celebratory dinner, no champagne, no emotional high. Just a brief handshake from the managing director, a congratulatory email, and a new line added to your signature. Vice President. You told your parents that evening, and your father let out a breathless, "Well done." Then asked if you'd thought about buying property yet. You nodded, said you were looking. You weren't. At work. You moved into a slightly larger office. A corner of the floor that caught sunlight in the afternoon. You had a real door now, one you could close. You never did. Somehow, that felt more isolating. The job changed, but not in the ways that mattered. More numbers, bigger stakes, fewer people who actually spoke like humans. Your inbox tripled. You stopped eating lunch altogether. The plant on your desk died. You replaced it with a bonsai. Low maintenance, clean lines. Easy to keep alive if you followed instructions. You were now the one junior associates whispered about. He's intense, but solid. He's always in early. He never misses a beat. You'd hear them outside your office and feel nothing. Not pride, not discomfort, just confirmation that the performance was holding. One morning, you arrived early and caught your reflection in the elevator panel. Hair flawless, tie straight, eyes unfamiliar. You touched your chest. Your heartbeat was there, but faint, like a soundtrack turned low enough not to distract from the scene. It wasn't that you felt fake. It was that you didn't feel at all. You still answered every call with poise, still wrote flawless recaps, still remembered people's birthdays and preferred coffee orders. You built systems for everything. Organization replaced emotion. Predictability became peace. Or so you told yourself. You hadn't laughed, truly laughed, since Alina. You hadn't dreamed of anything you wanted since. You couldn't remember. The team started relying on you for difficult clients. Your calmness read as confidence. Your silence as wisdom. You knew how to fill a room with steadiness. How to project stability even when your thoughts were somewhere else entirely. Once, at a holiday party, you caught the eye of a junior analyst. She looked overwhelmed. You pulled her aside, gave her advice you didn't believe in anymore. She smiled like you'd saved her. You nodded like it mattered. She thanked you later in an email. You didn't remember, what you'd said. Your weekends bled into each other. Errands, email catch-ups, occasionally a museum. Just to be among quiet things that didn't ask for much. You'd stare at oil paintings, trying to feel moved. Sometimes you'd fake it just to leave. You bought a new watch, not because you needed it, but because someone said it would complete the look. You were complete now, apparently. Sometimes you imagined getting in the elevator and pressing L, then walking past reception, past the deli on the corner, past the suits in the windows, and never coming back. But you never did, because even fantasies now felt like meetings you hadn't scheduled. Your therapist, the one you saw 3 times and then ghosted, once said something you couldn't forget. Sometimes we disappear so early in life that we grow up thinking the ghost is the real person. You almost laughed when she said it. Almost. You had become excellent at being the ghost. Excellent enough to be promoted. Excellent enough to be admired. Excellent enough to be empty. And the worst part, no one could tell. You started rehearsing your face, not in a vain way, not for vanity, but for accuracy. Before meetings, you'd check your expression in the reflective glass of your office. Forehead relaxed, lips soft, eyes just sharp enough to imply presence, but not challenge. You'd tilt your head ever so slightly when others spoke, just enough to signal engagement. It became choreography. Each morning, you'd walk into your office, slip off your coat, adjust the blinds halfway open to catch just the right slice of light. Sit down, take a breath, then begin the role. You spoke less than others, but always at the right time. A nod here, a one-liner there. Just enough to suggest that you had a deeper thought brewing, even if you didn't. Silence, after all, is easier to interpret than substance. There was a mirror tucked into the corner behind the door. You hadn't paid much attention to it until one day you caught yourself mid-sentence, practicing how to say a client's name with warmth. You were alone. You watched your face transform, smile, no smile, slight smirk, raised brow, confident, approachable, curious. You cycled through them all like switching masks. And suddenly, it hit you. You had no idea which one was real. You leaned in closer, studied your own eyes. They didn't blink. You laughed softly, more out of disbelief than humor. Then sat back down and opened your inbox, because there was work to do. Your phone rang. You answered with your morning voice, low, even, professional with a trace of warmth. You listened. You agreed. You ended the call with, absolutely, happy to help. Then hung up and stared at the phone as if it had just accused you of something. You didn't lie. You were happy to help. But you hadn't felt happy in months. You had become someone people relied on, someone respected, trusted, the safe pair of hands they called you in meetings. That phrase clung to you like a label. One day, in the middle of a quarterly review, You caught yourself imagining the carpet under your feet catching fire, not in a fearful way, just curious. What would happen if the floor beneath you suddenly demanded your full presence? Would you react? Would you feel? You shook the thought away, went back to charts. Your life outside the office had thinned. Friends faded, calls unanswered, invitations declined with polite excuses. The performance didn't end at 6 p.m. It simply moved locations. Evenings became scripted too: healthy takeout, a glass of wine, one episode of something smart but not too emotional. Then bed. Sometimes you'd lie on your mattress and stare at the ceiling, rehearsing conversations in your head, things you wished someone would ask you, answers you weren't sure how to give. What do you want? What do you need? Who are you when no one is watching? But no one asked, and you didn't say. You remembered your father again, the way he shined his shoes each Sunday, not because anyone would notice, but because it made him feel prepared. You polished yours on Thursdays. The bonsai tree started shedding. You researched how to revive it, but didn't follow through. You watched it dry, leaf by leaf, and said nothing. One night, you dreamed of your younger self, not doing anything special, just walking, carefree, whistling, wearing sneakers and a crooked grin. You followed him through your dream like a stranger, trying to catch up. He never looked back. When you woke, the sheets were still tucked too neatly. You went into the office early, poured a cup of coffee, and sat in the dark, watching the city blink awake outside your window. Your reflection hovered in the glass, superimposed over steel and light, and you whispered just to yourself, "I'm still in here, right?" No one answered. It was a Friday when you forgot to leave. Everyone else had packed up. The office was silent except for the soft, constant humming of machines that never sleep. You stayed behind under the pretense of finishing a client file. But in truth, you couldn't remember when you'd last felt finished with anything. You loosened your tie. It felt ceremonial. The lights on the trading floor across the glass glowed like distant constellations, each blinking red and green with someone else's future. They flickered in rhythm, like they were trying to speak. You didn't understand the message. Maybe you never had. There were still echoes in the hallway. A rolling chair that hadn't been pushed in. The rustle of air conditioning against glass. You walked down the corridor barefoot, just to feel something. The carpet was cheap, scratchy, grounding. You passed the conference room, where Elena once joked about turning off all the lights and dancing in the dark. You smiled at the memory, brief, ghost-like. You wandered into the kitchenette, poured water, took a sip, and forgot to swallow. It just rested in your mouth until your tongue ached. At some point, you drifted back to your office, turned off the overhead light, and sat with just the glow of your monitor. Your calendar still open, your name at the top, too bold, too capitalized, like it was trying too hard to convince someone it belonged there. The bonsai had tipped over again. You didn't fix it. You opened your drawer and pulled out the old business card you never gave anyone. It simply read, "You are not what you perform." You made it in a creative workshop 2 years ago. Some team building exercise. They told you to write a mantra. Everyone laughed at theirs. You didn't laugh. You kept yours. Now it looked like a note left behind by a stranger. You placed it back, gently. You stayed for hours. The sky outside deepened to a shade of blue you didn't know had a name. In the distance, the subway rumbled under the city, like a sleeping giant, indifferent to promotions, bonuses, image management. You picked up your phone, almost called your mother, just to hear a voice that didn't belong to this tower. But you didn't. Because what would you say? "Hi, I'm not sure I exist anymore." You laughed, quietly. It came out dry and surprised you. You stood up and looked out the window again. A single pigeon was perched on a distant ledge. You hadn't seen one in weeks. Maybe they knew something you didn't. You watched the bird for a long time. It didn't move. Neither did you. At some point, you turned off your screen and just sat in the dark. You didn't think. You didn't feel. You simply paused. That night, when you finally left the building, the air was cooler than expected. A breeze lifted your coat like it was inviting you somewhere. But you went home because habit always beats hope. You lay in bed and stared at the ceiling again. But this time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like space. And somewhere inside that space, the idea began to grow. What if you just stopped showing up? Not today, but soon. It happened in a meeting. Not a major one, just a midweek strategy session. The kind where people scroll through emails while pretending to listen. You were expected to present quarterly insights, polished, digestible, non-disruptive. The kind of update that makes everyone nod and move on. You opened the slideshow, cleared your throat, and began, as you can see from Q3 trends. Then something slipped. Maybe it was your tone, a hesitation in your voice, or the way the word trends caught in your mouth like a seed. But instead of moving on to the next bullet point, you paused, looked at the chart, really looked at it. The numbers were clean, predictable, but meaningless. And for the first time in a long while, you said what you were actually thinking. "I don't know what any of this means anymore." The room went quiet. It wasn't dramatic silence. More like someone had dropped a pen, and everyone was waiting to see if it rolled off the table. You scanned their faces, slight frowns, blinks. One guy smirked, assuming you were being ironic. But you weren't. You went on. "We hit targets, sure. But no one here seems to feel anything when we do. It's like we're playing a game none of us remember agreeing to. And I'm just tired." Someone coughed. Another shifted in their chair. A third checked their watch. Your boss, seated to your left, cleared his throat. Well, that's candid. Thank you for your honesty. He smiled, tight and polite. Shall we continue? And that was it. No one asked questions. No one pulled you aside afterward. The meeting resumed. The next slide came up. You clicked through it like nothing had happened. But something had. That night, you walked past your building and didn't stop. Just kept going. Turned left when you usually turned right. Ended up at a late night diner you hadn't seen in years. The kind with peeling booths and a menu that hadn't changed since the 70s. You sat alone, ordered pancakes, no syrup. The waitress called you Hon. You smiled. There were other people there. A cab driver reading a paperback, a couple laughing too loud, someone in a trench coat scribbling notes on a napkin. None of them knew your name. None of them needed anything from you. It felt safe. You sat there for over an hour, doing nothing but sipping coffee and watching the world not care who you were. It was beautiful. When you got home, you took off your suit and placed it over the back of a chair. Not hung, not folded, just placed, and you stared at it like it might speak. You wondered who you were when you weren't wearing it. And you realized you didn't know. The next day at work, you returned to your desk, answered emails, smiled in elevators. But something had shifted. You could feel it in the way your voice carried. Softer, slower, less performative. You still did your job, still met expectations. But you stopped trying to win the invisible race no one seemed to enjoy. You began leaving on time. You started saying, I don't know, in meetings, and letting the silence land. And no one stopped you. Because, oddly enough, no one was watching as closely as you thought. You'd built this version of yourself so carefully, so flawlessly, that people assumed it was permanent. But they didn't notice when the seams began to loosen. The ghost had started to step out of costume. One day, walking past the glass conference room, you caught a glimpse of your reflection again, and for once, you didn't adjust your expression. You just looked. And there you were. You didn't tell anyone you were leaving. Not at first. There wasn't a big moment, no dramatic exit, no resignation letter folded like a final flourish. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. You started taking longer routes to the office, pausing outside buildings that had nothing to do with you, lingering by newsstands just to smell the ink. You stopped replying to emails within 5 minutes. You let meetings go on without you if no one noticed. And they didn't. You walked slower in the hallways, started bringing lunch from home, sat in the park instead of the glass cafeteria. No one asked why. It turns out that when you build a reputation for being always fine, people stop looking beneath the surface. One Friday afternoon, you told yourself, Don't go in Monday. You didn't mean forever, just one day. But Monday came, and you found yourself on a bench by the river, drinking coffee from a paper cup, watching dogs chase geese, like there was nothing else in the world. Your phone buzzed a few times. You didn't reach for it. Tuesday came. You still didn't go in. By Wednesday, someone left you a voicemail. Professional, concerned, careful. Hope all is well. Just checking in. You didn't answer. By Friday, no one called. The office didn't collapse. The world kept moving. You weren't angry. You weren't trying to make a statement. You were just done. You went for walks with no destination. You read old books with cracked spines. You called your mother and asked about recipes she hadn't cooked in years. You watered the bonsai. It didn't revive, but that felt okay. One morning you rode the subway without looking at the map, got off at a random stop, sat in a cafe full of students, and laughed at a chalkboard that said, "No Wi-Fi. Pretend it's 1985. You ordered a croissant and thought, maybe I'm finally catching up to myself. At night, you dreamed of your old office. Not the place, but the rhythm, the routines, the endless loop. You walked through it like a museum of your former self. You waved politely to the role you used to play. He waved back, then turned away. You started writing again. Not reports, not summaries, just pages of unedited thought. It felt clumsy, honest, messy, but it felt real. You met Alana again by chance, at a bookstore. She was reaching for the same novel. You both laughed. "Look at you," she said, eyes scanning your unshaven face, your scuffed shoes. "You look alive." You smiled. "I think I am." You talked for an hour, maybe more. Not about the past, not about regrets, just life. Before parting, she touched your arm and said, "I'm glad you found your way out." You didn't correct her. You hadn't found your way out. You'd simply stopped going deeper in. A week later, you received a formal letter from HR. Your employment has been terminated due to prolonged, unexcused absence. There was a packet of documents, a severance offer, instructions to return your ID card. You slid the packet into a drawer and returned the card by mail. You didn't attend an exit interview. You'd already said goodbye. You no longer needed a title. Your name was enough. You don't remember the exact day you stopped checking your email. It just faded, like a background noise you no longer noticed. At first, your fingers still reached for the phone in the morning. Muscle memory, not intention. But gradually, even that reflex dulled, replaced by something slower, softer. You began waking up without an alarm. Some mornings, you lay there for a while, listening to the world open. Birds, distant cars, someone walking their dog outside. The city didn't need you to rush anymore. And for once, you didn't rush yourself either. You kept things simple, cooked your own food, took long walks to nowhere, You read fiction again, not for business metaphors, but for wonder. You sat in cafes and watched strangers the way you once watched markets, carefully, but without trying to predict anything. You visited your childhood home one weekend. Your father was older, slower, still sharp. He asked what you were doing these days. You hesitated, then said, "Trying to remember who I was before I got good at pretending." He didn't ask what you meant. He just nodded, as if somewhere deep down he understood. That night, you slept in your old room. The posters were gone, the carpet different, but the light from the street still came in at the same angle. You lay there, eyes open, breathing slow, no calendar, no meetings, no mask to prepare. You didn't cry, you didn't laugh, you just existed, like the silence was making room for you. In the weeks that followed, you moved through the city like a traveler with no map. You stopped checking reflections, stopped rehearsing conversations. You didn't need to be liked, or admired, or correct. You just needed to be real. One rainy afternoon, you passed the building where it all began. The tower, the glass walls, the mirrored elevator. You paused outside, watching others rush in, umbrellas snapping shut. You waited, not for anyone, just to witness. You wondered if anyone inside remembered you, and you realized it didn't matter, because you hadn't disappeared. You had returned to yourself, and in some strange, subtle way, that was more than enough. You kept walking, and the city kept breathing. Wind down, the sky dims now. The suit hangs quiet in the closet, not a costume, not a cage, just fabric, just thread. Outside, the traffic softens. Even the air feels slower, like the whole world is giving you permission to rest. You don't need to carry that name tonight, or that performance, or any of the stories you were told you had to believe. You are no longer a role. You are no longer applause waiting for a cue. You are the quiet between footsteps, the stillness behind the smile, and maybe, just maybe, the most real version of you never left. He was simply waiting for you to stop performing long enough to notice. So breathe. You've done enough. You are enough. You might not remember any of this tomorrow, but the dream will go on.